And good afternoon to you, and welcome to In Focus with Silvana Pavlovska, broadcasting from Melbourne, Australia. This program has a number of contributors who, from time to time, send information to us for inclusion into our program. And so it happens, we have received correspondence from one of our contributors, namely Mr. Ordan Andreevski, in relation to the submission which he has written to the Joint Standing Committee inquiry into AUKUS Treaty 2024. And we have permission from the author to share this information with you via our program In Focus with Silvana Pavlovska. Now, let me tell you something about the author. Mr. Ordan Andreevski is a peace and human rights activist from the Australian Macedonian community. He is focused on advancing Australian democracy, human rights, diplomacy, peace and justice, and sustainable development. He has made submissions to the Australian government and Parliament seeking ethical and socially responsible policy solutions and legislation to the most pressing challenges facing Australia, including innovation of democracy, human rights, and international relations. The Australian Macedonian diaspora has made a positive and significant contribution to Australian democracy, society, and its place in the world. As proud freedom fighters, Macedonians have fought for equality, democracy, and human rights in Macedonia and for Australia in selected conflicts in the 20th and the 21st century. Servicemen and women of Macedonian heritage have defended Australia in the Second World War and have participated in various missions in Timor-Leste, Afghanistan, Iraq, and beyond. Ordan Andreevski welcomes the opportunity to provide a submission to the inquiry into AUKUS Treaty by the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties. The focus on this submission is on providing a community-based assessment of the challenges and opportunities for innovating and improving the transparency and accountability into methods, policies, and procedures for analyzing and terminating the AUKUS Treaty. The views expressed here are those of the author only. The terms of reference: the approach of similar Westminster democracies around the world. There is no better recent example of new despotism in Australian democracy than the AUKUS Treaty. In particular, it was decided upon and on what principles, how it was decided upon, and on what principles by the major parties, and how propaganda and hybrid warfare are used to confuse and coerce the sovereign Australian citizens and Australia's liberal democracy society. Instead of preserving the declining unipolar world order of the G7 via AUKUS and global NATO, Australia should join the new security and development architecture of the global majority based on collaboration for mutual benefit via BRICS. According to Grayling 2020, there's no Westminster model of democracy that does not suffer from at least 5 of the 6 problems that subvert the democratic decision-making process. These vulnerabilities include growing use of propaganda, spin, falsehood, and manipulation by state and non-state actors. Money placing distorting pressure on policies in favor of oligarchs, corporations, political action committees, lobbyists, middle-class voters with deeper pockets. No separation of powers between executive and legislative in all but the US version. Toxic mix of careerism and organized factionalism make MPs and congressmen representative of the party line rather than the people in their electorate or country. Systemic deliberate alienation from political process of some youth, workers, unemployed through social media, feeling of disempowerment on the part of disenfranchised voters. Most Westminster system democracies have three weaknesses in their decision-making models. First, they fail to meet the quality standards for truly representative democracy. In particular, if they don't have a clearly codified constitution, UK, Canada, New Zealand, Saudi Arabia, Israel, if they have the first past the post-electoral systems, the majority of the population is effectively disenfranchised and end up as elective dictatorships. Second, they fail the good policy-making test, Percy 2019, by not using green and white paper discussion-making processes, referendums and citizen assemblies and historical lessons from the impact of wars to engage relevant stakeholders. There is a lack of rigor and transparency in public decision-making, including international militaristic treaties policy like AUKUS. Third, the foundations upon which most so-called liberal democracies stand are deeply flawed and at risk from corrosion from within. The most basic condition for representative democracy is for government by the people for the people, reflecting the broad range of views and demands of all Australians, not just the interests of one section of society, usually the ruling elites or one ideology. Australian parliamentary processes and practices, including opportunities for debate to provide greater transparency and accountability on the AUKUS Treaty, defining the problem. Australia's AUKUS Treaty was signed without the consent of the Australian people or approval by the Australian Parliament. It is not fit for purpose, neo-colonialist, unethical, elitist, undemocratic, embarrassing, and unsustainable. Forming military alliances with outlaw states, like the USA and the UK, must be the last option made collectively to defend Australia. It should incorporate the lessons from history, ethics, and strategic foresight. Under current constitutional arrangements, the Australian Prime Minister can use and abuse his colonial era Defence Act from 1903. The PM can commit Australia to foreign alliances and unwinnable neo-imperialist wars at the behest of reckless and unaccountable foreign governments like the United States of America, the United Kingdom, and the European Union. The military-industrial complex, the media, and war profiteers from the globalist finance and defense industries. The Great War, the Vietnam War, the Afghanistan War, the Iraq War, the Kosovo War, Bosnia War, Syria, Libya, Yemen are examples of how Australia has wasted blood and treasure for foreign imperialist wars that didn't threaten us directly, but resulted in massive human, economic, and environmental destruction of millions of innocent people. The decision by the former Prime Minister Scott Morrison to secretly commit Australia to AUKUS and the current Prime Minister Albanese to commit to AUKUS and the NATO-led war in Ukraine was done without any national, parliamentary, and policy debate. There was no critical analysis of how they got there and how Australia can facilitate peaceful alternative solutions instead of permanent wars. These are examples of how our political elites totally ignore the legitimate views and expectations of the Australian people, the democratic values and principles, the rules of law and human rights, which they neglect to justify their undemocratic and inhumane decisions. To stay relevant into the future, Australia's international military alliances decision-making model needs to become fully democratic, as defined by the Australian Constitution, the Australian Parliament, and the Australian people. The Australian Parliament and the Australian people should vote in a referendum if Australia is become and remain in AUKUS. A law must be debated and passed to make it illegal to participate in neo-imperialist and ideological militaristic alliances and wars of aggression. Just as Australian citizens are prohibited from fighting foreign wars, so should the nation-state of Australia. An inquiry into foreign interference by the USA, UK, EU, and others into Australian defence, strategic policy, and foreign affairs, and its impact on our sovereignty should be conducted as soon as possible. The AUKUS Treaty is illegal, as was signed in secrecy without national, parliamentary, and foreign policy debate. AUKUS is a rip-off to Australian taxpayers. It was initially offered as a good deal at, wait for this, 171 billion Australian dollars. The Australian Parliament and people were then shafted to accept 370 billion for the same aging, unnecessary, and useless products. It is unethical and unsustainable if it is not approved by the Australian Parliament and the Australian people. It must be focused achieving desirable outcomes such as peace with justice, defense of the homeland. AUKUS is not ethical, evidence-based, transparent, and accountable. It encourages neo-imperialism, arms races, and war profiteering. Decision-making about signing international defense treaties needs to be more socially and culturally inclusive. It needs to be more open to ideas from new voices, from diasporas, and evidence-based sources. It needs to be more open to collaboration and co-investment and better positioned for collective impact in a multipolar and interdependent world. Way too much propaganda and prestige is invested by the Australian government, by hawkish sections of the ADF, the military-industrial complex, and the media in glorifying war. Too little effort is invested in understanding and managing the detrimental social, economic, and environmental impact of militarization, wars, and arms races. Australian prime ministers and other cabinet members, hawkish generals, and others who defend the current AUKUS and global NATO in the Asia-Pacific arrangement should spend at least 3 months in a war zone and experience the impact directly with a next of kin before committing Australia to offensive war dangers. They should also live 3 months caring for ADF personnel who have suffered injury from wars and war zones before they can decide whether to send our ADF to war again. Ex-servicemen and women and their families should have a significant voice in the decision-making process. Australia must follow international best practice in ensuring co-design and co-producing world-class defense and foreign policies for principled and pragmatic reasons with engaged and fully informed citizens at the center of power and decision-making. Principally, it is a means of ensuring ethical and respectful policies grounded in an open and emancipatory framework. Practically, it is a means for ensuring common purpose and collective action towards policy improvement. Australian Parliament should conduct a forum on the excellent book How the World Works by Noam Chomsky. It explains what Uncle Sam really wants: the prosperous few and the precarious many, secrets, lies, and democracy, and the common good. Australian Parliament should implement the whole-of-nation approach 2024 to foreign affairs, defence, and geopolitical competition. AUKUS is incompatible with the whole-of-nation approach to international policy. Emerging trends. A number of trends and factors have caused a significant change in Australia's strategic and operational environment in the last decades. The domestic, social, and political environment in Australia is more conducive to increasing the level of scrutiny, innovation, accountability, and transparency for military alliance decision-making. Informed citizens are demanding power, better political engagement processes, and peaceful policies and outcomes for Australia and the planet. Australians and the world expect Australia to be a good international citizen. Evans 2022, a state that cares about other people's suffering, poverty, climate change impact, weapons proliferation, war prevention, human rights, and ethics. Prominent Australians like Carrillo Ganta and many others are deeply concerned about dismal diplomacy and disposable sovereignty, a problem with China and America. The Albanese government and the Australian Parliament must recognise that the vast majority of Australians demand independent foreign and defence policies. They want a republic with an elected Australian as head of state. Way too much power is exercised by unelected monarchs, the Governor-General, oligarchs, and corporate cartels from the military, industrial, and financial complex. Australian taxpayers expect a greater return on social, economic, and environmental investment from the ADF budget, which should be used for defence of the homeland only or for humanitarian and peacekeeping purposes in our region. Australians reject militarism and ever-expanding security state at the expense of the economy, people, and the environment. Australian society and responsible policy makers recognize that peace, stability, economic growth, and more effective peace and development outcomes can be achieved through innovation and collaboration between government, the corporate sector, the not-for-profit sector, the ODA sector, as well as diaspora communities. The international strategic environment is also rapidly changing. There's growing global concern and action from political and societal or social leaders across the planet about the urgent need to stop the danger of nuclear war and the new arms race. Australia, Russia, Ukraine, the US, and NATO are urged to reject the use of nuclear weapons as an option. Nuclear war is unwinnable and must never be fought. Such an agreement is, says Ordan Andreevski, possible under a new security and development architecture that recognizes and respects the legitimate security concerns of all the planet's nations. All nations must follow the Westphalia peace model from 1648 and the non-aligned movement model based on respect for sovereignty, commitment to the common good of the other, and forgiveness of debts that can make true economic development possible. Sheila, 2022. We are living in an era where post-truth policies, McClinchy, 2022, are undermining our representative democracy, peace and stability at home and internationally. The Oxford Dictionary defines post-truth as circumstances in which facts are less influential in shaping public opinion and political action than emotion, belief, and distortion. This is particularly relevant to how our current model of international military alliance decision-making operates. Through our dangerous alliance with outlawed states like the US, the UK, and other so-called neoconservative actors and the military-industrial complex, Australia has lost its sovereignty. It has also lost its ability to act in the national interest in matters such as defence, strategic policy, and foreign affairs, as viewed by the Australian people and not the elites. Crucial decisions are made without the consent of the Australian Parliament and the Australian people, who can elect and remove bad governments. The world's population is increasing rapidly in low to medium income countries, placing pressure on them and on the developed world to find innovative solutions to pressing unmet human needs, including sustainable development. Global warming and the disasters that are linked to it is posing major problems, not only in the developing world, but also in the developed world, as seen by the recent floods in Australia, Pakistan, Brazil, and the Philippines. The ability of countries such as the People's Republic of China, India, Brazil, and others to lift the millions of people out of poverty through economic growth, industry policy reform, organizational, community, institutional, and system innovation demonstrates that war is not needed for addressing poverty, climate change, injustice, and the Millennium Development Challenges. Australian foreign policy and diplomacy must be better focused on more strategic and lead other areas of statecraft, in particular in the search for sustainable and just peace when new despots in leading and emerging democracies are rejecting it as an option, as seen in Ukraine. The technological revolution, especially the internet, smartphones, social media, and other forms of digital communication, are connecting communities to reliable knowledge and action about democracy, effective institutions, and good governance. The Australian people are better informed on most issues and demand better outcomes. In this context, Australian policymakers, government, and stakeholders have an opportunity to rethink their theories of change and decision-making models in order to deliver new and improved value from Australia's investment in defence and diplomacy. This inquiry is an ideal time to closely examine the types of strategies, capabilities, and budgets that are required for greater impact. Australia can show leadership by contributing research and narrative on how to peacefully solve global challenges in a multipolar and interdependent world in the face of the arrival of emerging contenders from the Indo-Pacific and the shift of power away from the West. It is also a time to think about the analytical and policy-making capabilities of the Australian government and parliament and how it can better connect with the best available evidence and knowledge from civil society, community, business, industry, not-for-profit, and diasporas. Mr. Ordan Andreevski has listed a number of references here. I shall name them. Asia-Pacific Development, Diplomacy and Defense Dialogue 2024. What does it look like for Australia to take a whole-of-nation approach to international policy? Canberra 2024. Gantner 2022, Dismal Diplomacy, Disposable Sovereignty, Our Problem with China and America in the National Interest from Monash Uni Press. Grayling AC, The Good State on the Principles of Democracy, 2020. Evans G, Good International Citizenship, The Case for Honesty in the National Interest Series, Monash Uni Publishing. McGlinchey S. et al., 2022, Global Politics in a Post-Truth Age, International Relations, www.e-ir/to-the-right, info/to-the-right. Percy A., 2019, Submission to the Procedure Committee of the New South Wales Legislative Council on the Contentious Bills motion on the 20th of June 2019, Evidence-Based Policy Research project facilitated by the New Democracy Foundation. And the Schiller Institute 2022, Stop the Danger of Nuclear War Now, online conference from November 2022. So that was a submission to the Joint Standing Committee inquiry into AUKUS, AUKUS Treaty 2024 by Mr. Ordan Andreevski, who's a peace and human rights activist from the Australian Macedonian community. He's focused on advancing Australian democracy, human rights, diplomacy, peace with justice, and sustainable development. He has made submissions to the Australian government and parliament seeking ethical and socially responsible policy solutions and legislation to the most pressing challenges facing Australia, including innovation of democracy, human rights, and international relations. So that was that submission from Ordan Andreevski. We would like to thank him for allowing us to share that document with you. And you may also be able to yourselves do a submission if you chose to do so to the Joint Standing Committee inquiry into the AUKUS Treaty 2024. A treaty, by the sound of things, that was never discussed, or the public wasn't consulted. No decision was made by the public and the parliament, but the Prime Minister seems to have made that decision solely, and the current Prime Morrison, that is, and the current Prime Minister Albanese is continuing with that decision made by Morrison. So we'll keep this topic alive should anything else come up. So thank you for watching In Focus with Silvana Pavlovska, and I'm looking forward to seeing you very soon again. Bye for now.